Hola, ¿qué tal amigos? Estrellita Fuentes, muchísimas gracias por acompañarme una vez más en otra entrevista. Un personaje que sin duda a muchos de ustedes les va a interesar conocer. Nos encontramos en la Ciudad de México en el marco de la visita de la señora Irene Khan, quien es la relatora de la ONU para la protección al derecho a la libre opinión y a la libre expresión. También fue titular de Amnistía Internacional y tiene un currículum impresionante como abogada y activista en pro de los derechos humanos, de las mujeres y de los periodistas. Mrs. Khan, I really appreciate this interview. Thank you so much for being in Mexico.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this interview.
Mexico, unfortunately, is allocated in the highest ranks of danger for journalism. Which is the scope or the perspective that you have specifically about Mexico?
Unfortunately, as you say, Mexico is one of the most dangerous countries for journalists. Mexico is in the same group as Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine. These are countries where there is war. In Mexico, there is no war, but journalists are killed because of organized crime and because of the nexus between organized crime and politics and the justice and legal system. So there is impunity. If someone thinks they can kill a journalist and get away with it, they will do it again. And the effect is not only on one journalist, the effect actually is on many others because it chills the speech when there is threat. Mexico is a democratic country. In democratic countries, journalists, media, free media, independent media plays a very important role. And to see journalists being killed, but also impunity, most journalist cases are not investigated. That actually threatens democracy. Mm-hmm. It's a threat to human rights, it's a threat to democracy, and I'm very concerned about the situation in Mexico. I first came to Mexico 20 years ago, and since then I have met the government. I have met the government at the highest level, three Mexican presidents, one after the other, and they have all promised that they will address impunity, and they have not. I think this is a colossal failure of political will to ensure freedom of expression and media freedom, which is guaranteed under your constitution. But governments are failing to respect it, both at the federal level and at the state level.
Since the year of 2000, 150 journalists, Mexican journalists, have been killed. And it was 2 years ago when the Undersecretary of Human Rights, Alejandro Encinas, the former Undersecretary Alejandro Encinas, recognized exactly what you said, this nexus between the cartels and the politicians, which is a total danger for the free expression of journalists. This bizarre nexus, which is unthinkable, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's very, very dangerous. I don't think that any democratic state can progress economically and socially if the politicians and organized crime are so close together that the justice system doesn't work. The justice system is important for our civil and political rights, for our economic and social rights, but also for economic development. Because what is happening really here in simple terms is journalists are investigating abuse of power, journalists are investigating corruption, journalists are investigating corruption in the legal system by which organized crime thrives. And when journalists expose the story, that's when journalists are killed and the state
or kidnapped or disappeared or threatened.
And sometimes they don't have to kill, they have to threaten. I've heard stories about journalists receiving phone calls saying, "Oh, we know where your children are," and that is enough to frighten. We're all human beings, we can get intimidated, and that's how the story is killed. They think that by threatening the journalists, they will kill the story. Actually, by threatening journalists, and if the government does not take action against it, what they're doing is they are slowly destroying the state. They're destroying the institutions of the state, but they're also weakening the economy. investors will not come and invest in a place where their investment will not be safe. If you kill a journalist because corruption is being exposed, then is corruption a good thing? It isn't. It is not good for the economy. It is not good for society. So when politicians collude with organized crime, they are actually eroding democracy. They're eroding the country. They're doing a bad thing.
Then why is it so important that the countries guarantee absolutely the freedom of expression and the freedom of journalism to do what they do?
Well, freedom of expression is one of the oldest rights. It goes back hundreds of years ago for the struggle. People struggle against abuse of power. Freedom of expression empowers citizens. With freedom of expression, why do you need freedom of expression? Why do you need journalists? You need journalists to expose abuse of power. You need freedom of expression for people to be able to discuss and debate and agree.
And to create balance, actually, in society.
Exactly, your different points of views. If you have different points of views, you hear more information. If ordinary people receive different kinds of news, different media. I'm not saying that there is only one truth. No. The more the sources of information, good, reliable information, the better the citizen becomes, and the responsibility of the state. If people in power don't like what you're saying as a journalist, all they have to do is themselves be transparent. They can be transparent, they can go out, they can put information out. In fact, under international human rights law, freedom of expression includes the right to receive, to share, to disseminate information. And there is a duty on the part of the state to provide information to citizens. Yes, the state has to give citizens access to information, public information.
And the citizen might be able to take informed decisions.
Yes, exactly. So citizens can take informed decisions. So if the government officials, the governor of your state or the mayor of your town doesn't like what you're saying, well, they can go out and explain why they disagree with you. That's the way democracy works. And
instead of threatening,
of course, you see, under international law, political speech is protected in the sense that the government cannot throw political opponents into the prison. Politicians can campaign during elections and can say what they want, explain their views. So they have that. And when they get elected, when they're put into power, then officials have an obligation to their own citizens to be honest with their own information and
transparent.
to engage in debate.
And to be transparent.
And to be transparent, exactly. That's their obligation. Transparency is an obligation of good governance. And to share information openly and to be able to allow others to speak openly. Political criticism is a very important part of democracy. Criticizing politicians is what democracy is about.
Exactly. And you have been working as a reporter for the United Nations in this program 20 years ago. In all this time, you have had the opportunity to speak with many journalists, especially women. Which are like the main challenges all over the world that women as a journalist are facing in the meantime?
I was appointed to this position of an independent expert of the United Nations about 3 years ago. I'm the first woman to hold this position, although the position was created 30 years ago. So it took the United Nations 27 years to appoint a woman. And when I took up the responsibility, I began to look around and I could not find a single report written about women's freedom of expression. So I decided to start writing it. I spoke to a lot of people. I did research. I invited people to share their opinion. And I discovered that freedom of expression, if you read the language of it, in the international documents, is gender neutral. It does not say anything about men or women. But when you look at real life, freedom of expression is very heavily gendered. We all understand that speech is sometimes censored. But usually men's speech is censored by law. Women's speech is censored by law, but also by culture, custom, religion, your family, your community. what you wear, how you do your hair, who you're going out with, what you're talking. All that comes together. So when you are a woman politician, you're criticized in ways that male politicians are not. When you're a woman journalist, you are endangered in ways that male journalists are not. I have looked specifically at the case of women journalists. Usually, they tend to be attacked online in very vicious, sexist, misogynistic ways.
Or digital campaigns.
Digital campaigns against women, smear campaigns on their reputation.
Exactly.
And they are
That's what happened to me
yes,
once.
And they're doubly threatened. You are threatened as a woman because they pick out your gender, your identity, and attack you on that. And you are threatened as a journalist. So you are you're attacked from two sides. And it can be extremely harmful because sometimes the threats they make online can become threats offline. Exactly. And that is another reason why politicians also have to be very careful about what they say about women journalists, for example, because when they put out statements about women journalists or women professionals or women human rights defenders saying that they're not competent, these women are not behaving properly, they are delegitimizing. They're actually reinforcing the prejudices that exist in our society against women. So
exactly.
They are actually pushing back progress. They're pushing back gender equality.
They are leaving us behind.
Yeah.
And just for finishing this interview, which I really appreciate your time, would you like to share a message for the Mexican audience, for the Mexican journalists, and especially for the Mexican women who work as a journalist?
Well, as I said, I came to Mexico first 20 years ago, and one of the first things I was involved in at that time as Secretary General of Amnesty International was the campaign to stop violence against women in Chihuahua and in the state of Chihuahua at that time. And I was deeply impressed by what I saw of the women's movement, of civil society, women journalists, the stories that came out. And I admire the courage of the women of this country in the way in which they have been fighting for the gender equality. If you look at journalists, Mexico is one of the countries with the highest number of killing of journalists, and yet there are journalists, there are people, men and women, who want to take up the profession of journalists because they believe in the importance of providing information, truthful information, different points of views to the state. So to the journalists, to the women activists, to the women journalists, I say, you are courageous women in this country, and you are an inspiration to all of us. Please keep up your good work.
Thank you, Mrs. Khan, for your time and for this interview. And I hope that we may have the opportunity to talk once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pues muchas gracias, queridos amigos. Ella es la relatora de la ONU para la protección al derecho a la libre opinión, a la libre expresión, la señora Irene Khan, a quien le agradecemos mucho su tiempo. Estamos en la Ciudad de México. Les mandamos un fuerte abrazo. Muchísimas gracias por sintonizarnos.